everybody, this is Poppy Gerrard-Abbott, researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and you're listening to my podcast series, Difficult Conversations. Today, we're discussing the recent national strike action in UK higher education, which was followed by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, we're going to try and link these two periods together with a critical and a sociological lens, and with the strike campaigning causes, aims, and asks in mind. So I'm really happy to introduce Grant Buttars, President of UCU Edinburgh, and Vivek Santayana, PhD researcher at the University of Edinburgh. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hi, Poppy.
Hello, thanks so much for being on the podcast. If you'd like to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and a bit more about your roles.
Yeah, so like you said, Poppy, I'm a PhD student and guaranteed hours tutor at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also a member of the UCU Edinburgh branch postdoc network and the branch committee.
And yeah, as Poppy, as you said, I'm the branch president at UCU Edinburgh. I'm also a member of the UCU Scotland executive, but outside that, I've also been involved in political activism for, longer. Let's just say it's in decades. I won't say how many.
Fantastic. So two people that are, so suited to be having this conversation linking the strike period and the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for joining me today. So we're going to dive straight into discussion, kicking us off with the question, what inequalities in higher education did the recent UCU strike action highlight? And how do you both think these inequalities link to the inequalities highlighted from the COVID-19 pandemic? Either of you can kick us off with an answer.
I mean, to me, the strikes came down to one key issue, and it's a model of higher education which just demands more and more from us for less and less reward. Whether it's through pay inequality, insecure contracts, excessive workloads, and then not even giving us the compensation of security and retirement, staff has had enough. We're a large, diverse workforce. These issues affect us in different ways and to different degrees. However, as a trade union, we're a collective and we stand together. So when we return from our period of strike action to deal with how the COVID-19 epidemic was manifesting itself on the ground in our workplace and how it was affecting our lives, I think that stood as a central focus on how we were going to approach dealing with it, how we were going to respond to the way the university was behaving. And I think it's a constant that runs through what we're doing just now.
Yeah, and just to add to what Grant just said, it's not just the model of higher education that demands more and more from staff for less reward. It's also a fundamentally exploitative way in which the labor and goodwill of staff are being abused by the management. And this is even more urgent given the way the management has responded to the COVID-19 crisis, when they urged university staff to transition in around a week to online teaching and online admin. They gave staff very little notice, very little training on this, and insisted that staff adapt not just their teaching styles, but also the content and the manner in which they'd deliver them and assess students on it in about a week's time, which is unreasonable, and it's also something which staff have been given next to no guidance or support for. And then there are more complicated issues that arise out of this. People on guaranteed hours contracts particularly face uncertainty about whether or not their funding or their contract will continue once the crisis is abated. People on visas face disruptions to their regular work, and that disruption might affect their visa status. A lot of people would need to apply to extend their visas afterwards so that any extensions to their contract can still be added onto their visa, but that has prohibitively expensive financial barriers to being able to apply. So there are a number of issues that come out of this, and all these issues around workload and pay equality and also immigration were on the agenda for the UCU industrial action as well.
Thank you both so much. So how has the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the weaknesses of the university's business model?
I mean, putting it very simply, the university has spent a fortune on buildings and very little on staff. And we have just realized that the campuses the university builds are pointless if the campuses are shut down by a pandemic. It's the lack of investment in staff that is pushing staff to breaking point. And the university just does not adequately support or compensate the staff for the work they do, even the work they've been asked to do over and beyond what their usual contractual requirements are during this time.
The economic model, I think you've got to look at this more broadly as well. The economic model that we live under is fundamentally broken, and not just the higher education sector, but more broadly. And COVID-19 has shone a very bright light on this, showing not just that the specific responses were far from adequate, but the accepted orthodoxies that have dominated for decades have absolutely nothing to offer in this current crisis. And when you think of it, universities should be at the heart of challenging, but they've completely sold their souls to neoliberal economics. So it's unsurprising that they either cannot or will not respond as is demanded of them during this crisis. And then this is not to let them off the hook, but rather we need to demand change. At one level, they seem to be sort of scurrying around like headless chickens, not really understanding what they're dealing with. At another level, they are just sort of trying to pretend that it's business as usual, when to everybody else, this is nothing like business as usual. We cannot go on like this.
Yes, absolutely. It's so interesting how the conversations that we're having now are almost taking us back to the conversations under the coalition government when the rise in tuition fees were proposed. I feel like I'm having the same conversations that I did back then. They're the same asks, the same campaigns. So it leaves me feeling very pessimistic that so much time has passed, and yet this aggressive form of a neoliberal business model, as you mentioned, Grant, seems to be gripping higher education more than ever. So I hope that this pandemic will, if any learnings come out of it and takeaways, that we start to really see the cracks in the business model.
There's also, all the cracks in the university's systems are more apparent when you consider the university's own responses to the crisis itself. To begin with, the university was really slow in coming to a decision about suspending teaching. They were even slower when it came to things like closing the main library, which took them a good 2 or 3 days to decide to do. And all of this was in the interest of making sure they could still deliver a service to students rather than think in the interest of the safety of staff and students themselves. And the slowness in the university's response highlights the lack of due regard given to the ethical dimensions of the way in which they operate. And instead, they still see this as a business or a service that they're providing, and they're trying to maximize the provision of such a service, even under such unprecedented and volatile conditions.
Absolutely. And the same can be said for, not only student well-being and health, but also staff well-being and health. Staff who, for example, are responsible for the operational running of the library. So librarians and administrators and so on also have to be in an environment that puts them disproportionately exposed to the virus. And they tend to be people, obviously, on some of the lowest paid contracts in the university. So it's interesting to make links there between the staff who have the privilege to be able to go home and work from home, and those that have to continue working completely unnecessarily for, as you say, the sake of the university trying to carry on business as usual and fulfill its the customer service relationship, the delivery of services to their students, which takes priority over student and staff as well-being. Absolutely. So I'm going to ask you both a slightly controversial question, but I think it's one that I would really love to hear your answers on. So we obviously had a long strike period that was it 3 weeks?
The precise number of weeks of the strike period varies from university to university. It was 3 weeks at Edinburgh University because the first official week of the national industrial action took place during our reading week. So we postponed our industrial action days from that week and added them on to the other weeks, which is why our strike went on for 3 weeks. In some other universities, it was anywhere between 4 or 5, depending on the precise dates in which the strike happened.
Yeah, it was 14 strike days, but in different patterns. And of course, we had the 8 days before Christmas as well.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. So we obviously had a long strike period across many universities across the UK, followed by almost, they overlapped. They directly followed on from each other, then the COVID-19 pandemic. So do you think that students, as a result of this, should get their tuition fees back?
This is always a problematic question, but I think it's best to reframe it. I mean, let's just go back to the first principle that there should be no tuition fees in the first place. Education is not a commodity, it's a right. It's there for the common good, not for the atomised advancement of individuals. So campaigning simply for a refund legitimises the problem. But I'll qualify that by saying I'm not going to actively oppose anybody who wants to campaign for impoverished students to be reimbursed. And I'm certainly not going to defend the university who have milked fee income for all it's worth. I don't want to defend them from being hit quite substantially in the pockets. So I think when you engage with this question, it's important to put it into that context.
I mean, I'm absolutely with you on this one, Grant. And I am an international student. I used to pay international student fees when I was an undergraduate and a postgraduate. I've been funded by scholarships at the university for my PhD, but previously I was the demographic that presented the university with a majority of its revenue. International students in particular pay some of the highest fees across the board. And I am with you on this entirely, that there should be no tuition fees to begin with. At the same time, it is something that I find deeply conflicting, because as a tactic, I think it is expedient for students to campaign for refunds because this hurts the university in their pockets. But I'm with you on the principle that there should be no tuition fees to begin with. The university is not a service for the benefit of a privileged few. It is meant to be a public good for the welfare of all society. And accepting the transactional nature of this does capitulate to that kind of commercial neoliberal logic, which is the biggest danger I see here. In the past, the university did have very opaque policies in the way in which it administered refunding its tuition fees. Things like a student experience fund, which students could then draw from to participate in other activities from the university, either taking up a language course or learning a new skill or something else. It was all very vague, and students had to individually make a case for the money. And this lack of transparency has been hugely problematic. I did put in a Freedom of Information request to the university about how exactly they disbursed all of these withheld pay sort of monies that were sort of withheld from staff who went on strike. Owing to the crisis, I have not received a response to the FOI request, so I'm going to give it some more time and follow it up soon and try and investigate this further. But it is such a difficult issue, and on one level, I don't want students to have to pay tuition fees in the first place. But at the same time, I do acknowledge that some students pay an obscene amount of money, and it is not their fault that we exist in this transactional neoliberal market where education is commodified. So I'm all for them asking for their money back, because it is a university that is at fault morally for charging them in the first place.
Thank you both for your answers. I'm also hoping that there's going to be some action around student accommodation rent. And I have been seeing strikes taking place in other universities, but I'm waiting to see developments in the Edinburgh context. So at the moment, I'm having conversations with a few different campaigners in Edinburgh to see whether something is going to happen, because at the moment, all the university has offered is a short window for students to break their contract if they wish to. And I think that there was a tone to the communications that this was like a hyper generous offer, but a lot of students have no income at the moment, and there are additional strains on finances from whoever gives them money and gives them financial support. So say family. So people in general are just receiving less money. And so to expect rent for accommodation, I think is, again, an example of trying where they can to carry on business as usual with absolutely no adaptation to what's happening at the moment.
You're absolutely right there. And one of the issues that the Students' Association has been campaigning on quite vocally is with accommodation services and giving students the opportunity to withdraw from their contracts, but also in what is a reasonable time frame. Now, as you said, they have been given a short notice period. That notice period is a period of 28 days. So 28 days when they would still be paying rent after they would have already had to move back home during the pandemic. So a lot of students do stand to pay rent in the month of April when they're not using their accommodation. And this is not just Edinburgh University's accommodation services, but it's also all the other luxury student housing that opened up, like Unite and all of those other student housing services. UCU has been negotiating with them, and the sabbatical officers have been lobbying on the students' behalf. But this just goes to show a much wider problem of the way in which education is commodified, not just in what the university provides, but also the way in which luxury student accommodation opens up in the city and markets very expensive and very upmarket kinds of housing, which are, in all honesty, not fit for purpose, but also obscenely expensive. And they, at this time, are still trying to maximize the profit they can get from these students, even though there is no practical or moral need for them to continue honoring those contracts, given that these are exceptional circumstances. And, you can very much imagine if the boot were on the other foot and there is some kind of internal sort of contamination of water supply in a particular student housing building, they would ask the students to relocate to a different place and cancel their contracts and refund them accordingly. But now that the students are having to withdraw for a more general global pandemic, they are beating the students with a stick for this and trying to gouge them for all their money's worth, which is utterly reprehensible. And it just goes to show how the economy around students expands to not just exploiting them for their tuition fee revenue, but also other services in the city that provide a certain kind of experience for students of a certain income bracket. And it is very precarious. And I suspect that all these companies also stand to make further losses because the fringe has been cancelled as of today. So they will not be able to rent out their premises at obscene rates during the fringe. And I think this is going to have a lot of people trying to recoup their costs by exerting those pressures on students rather than Airbnb-ing it or renting this out over the fringe. And I think that's something that I'd like to see how it develops, because I'm concerned that might be backlash that students in Edinburgh can face.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think this is another thing that's worth putting on a larger frame around. I mean, the issue of the costs that people are incurring at an individual level because of circumstances out with their control is that there's also a staff dimension to this. We have been pushing the university on the increased costs certain types of people will have by being at home, whether that is additional gas and electricity bill, whether that's costs incurred by different types of childcare arrangements they're having to make just now. There's a whole variety of things that people will be facing, and not engaging with them goes contrary against the headline that the university likes to put in its online guidance, that people will suffer no financial detriment. Well, people are going to be suffering financial detriment, and the people with the means to alleviate that are our employers, our government. But in terms of who we are negotiating with, it's our employers. In terms of who the students, it is our employer, which is the university. In terms of who the students can call on for support on this, it is the university. The university has deep financial pockets, and they should be digging into them a bit more.
Yes, absolutely, Grant. I guess my point here is that lots of staff feel that the university is taking one step forward and then two steps back in terms of their response to the COVID pandemic. So going back on promises that they have given to staff, changing their position day by day on what the working realities during the pandemic will be, changing their policies around things like childcare, caregiving leave, annual leave, changing the policies around tutors' marking. So last week it was the case that tutors would get paid for all of their marking as promised, even though some assessments may not go ahead, and now the hours are being potentially redeployed, so they will have to work for those hours. So it seems that the university position is changing a lot, and it's the staff that have to be constantly bringing this up to the university. The burden of ensuring that the university keeps to their word is a burden that falls on the staff to be constantly bringing up problems and changes and holding them to account.
I think that in many respects, it's just what we've come to expect from the university. We've seen this through other negotiations in better times. We've seen it during the strike, but I think the other side of that is the whole issue around solidarity. And if it takes us back almost to the first question, some of the most remarkable things that happened during the past strike, and indeed ones before that, is the solidarity between staff and students. And that continues today. I think the issues we've just been talking about is in a university's duty of care to both staff and students, and how they're failing in both. So the way that we would, from a trade union perspective, you fight back against that is through solidarity actions, and that's building actions, staff and students together, and finding those common demands that you can campaign and mobilise around.
Absolutely. I just want to comment on that before we move on to our final question. I am still very mindful, though, that the burden for action and change still falls on those most affected by the decisions of the university. So whilst I think that solidarity is so important and gives us so much weight and voice behind the strike asks and the strike campaigns, the emotional impacts of constantly being in this fighting mode and having to be the ones that pull up the mistakes and the flaws in the university's policies and approaches as we've experienced this pandemic. That's all work that staff members have had to do on top of their workloads of moving everything online, trying to fulfill the expectations of the business as usual approach, the caring responsibilities that have come with the pandemic. Also, on top of that, staff are taking on this workload of making sure that the university is providing a basic duty of care.
Yes, I'm trying to think about how you address that, because I'm certainly aware, particularly in the last couple of weeks, that all I've been doing, all the other activists and the branch have been doing is reacting to what the university has or hasn't been doing. I think it's about time we actually start saying, no, let's start setting the agenda. Let's not just be reactive. Let's get on the front foot with some of this stuff. We're in unprecedented times, and how we come out of this is not going to be how we go into this. So being more proactive as a branch, as a union more generally, and as a working class more in a broader sense entirely. Let's start deciding what we want instead of this horrible mess that we're living through just now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same can be said about the industrial action as well as the responses to COVID-19. There is this increase in movements around solidarity, but what we definitely need is more people to be proactive within the union itself. And the good thing about any such action is that it demonstrates the strengths of an organization like a trade union. So it creates an opportunity for more people to get involved, either as activists in various committees, or people on pickets, or volunteers to assist other people to do their food shopping when they're isolating at home. And the more people that get involved, the more it takes that burden off of the shoulders of the people most directly affected by this. Which is why, we always hope that after industrial action or after any big crisis like this, we get more people volunteering to be local contacts of the union or to be caseworkers or union reps. And this builds that movement and builds that momentum. If we can do this, then we can allow ourselves as a union and as a branch to be more proactive. I know that a lot of people are really stretching themselves very thin, covering so many bases, like Catherine, for example, who's one of our anti-casualization officers, as well as Kevin, the other anti-cas officer. Both of them have been investigating the impact this has had on people on very precarious and insecure contracts, but also from a dimension that affects their immigration status. And it's a lot of taxing work to investigate everything individually. And there are some people who are really fighting very hard and giving a lot of time and energy to this. We have, I'm really glad that the union exists as an organization to do this and keep the employers in check when their responses have been quite problematic. And definitely, as Grant said, we need to start setting the agenda and being more proactive to direct a way out of this mess rather than just reacting to everything the university is doing.
I guess what I would really like to hammer home is that the burden of change for a particular issue always rests on the shoulders of those most affected by the issue, which acts as a further layer of victimization and an extra layer of emotional taxation and labour for those affected by particular issues and having to resist particular issues every day. So, for example, gender-based violence, although it disproportionately affects women are the majority of victim survivors, the burden for change rests on the shoulders of women, even though it is fundamentally, if you were to frame it in a really simplistic way, a men's issue or a societal issue, but the burden is shouldered by women. Anyway, moving on to my final question for today's podcast. What positive political change do you hope to come from the COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think there will be a shift to the left?
Yeah, personally, I hope so is all I can say, because I've lived through the SARS and the swine flu pandemics, and none of them had that dramatic a change in the political scenario back in my home country when those pandemics hit. So I don't really know. I hope so, because the scale at which COVID-19 has been spreading is one that is unprecedented. The way this is being covered in news media and social media is huge, and this has exposed all the faults of the social and economic systems in which we live. A lot of people have responded to that in very creative ways, starting their own mutual aid groups, trying to set up charity fundraising opportunities to support food banks or other COVID-19 response charities. A lot of people have taken to independent measures as well. You started a podcast, Poppy. Another friend of mine has facilitated online support groups for people with mental health issues that are aggravated by this kind of isolation. And this has created a movement to show solidarity amongst people and this has exposed that a society is only as resilient as its most vulnerable member when it comes to widespread pandemics like this. But whether or not this is going to be a long-term sustainable movement is something that I am still agnostic about. I really hope it does persist and it does create some change in our society beyond just a flash in the pan that is forgotten shortly afterwards. Because that's what happened with SARS and swine flu. And I really hope that this reveals all the systemic fault lines in our system and the inequalities and how those inequalities further exacerbate the existing health emergency that everyone faces.
I'm hopeful too, but it's certainly not inevitable. I'm turning into a bit of a cliche in terms of the times I keep saying this to people, but I think we're at the Rosa Luxemburg's line about socialism or barbarism seems appropriate here. And those who know me know that I love to quote Rosa Luxemburg, but I've never felt more that particular line was more relevant in the current situation. As I said earlier, we're not going to come out of this crisis the way we went into it. And there are lots and lots of great examples of grassroots activism springing up all over the place, whether it's mutual aid groups, whether it's some sort of independent sort of networks across the trade union movement. I was in an online demonstration of about 250 people at lunchtime today protesting against redundancies at Forth Valley College, what they're trying to bring in on the back of the current crisis. I was in a meeting of a couple of hundred people of trade unionists from all parts of the UK and a few from elsewhere. One night last week, actually, I've probably been in more online meetings in the past week than I've probably been to physically in the last few months. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but that doesn't mean that the outcome is certain. The root causes of the problems that we face are not going to simply wither away, and the alternative, better tomorrow, that we want and we need it's still going to have to be fought for, and it's going to be a hard fight. To use Naomi Klein's term, this is also shock doctrine territory. There are vultures circling, wondering how they can exploit this crisis for their own ends, which are not the ends that will benefit us at all. So there's fantastic stuff going on at grassroots level, as I said, which can give us the foundations we need, but there's a lot more that we need to do. I think there's also a challenge for some sections of the traditional left here to cease the petty tribalism, because if we don't, they would either be part of this or they're going to be consumed by it.
And Grant, what you were saying about disaster capitalism, I find it rather interesting that Zoom communications stock has exploded since January. So there are people who are inevitably profiting from this. And I am wary of our own complicity in all this by buying those products and commodities uncritically to facilitate our own ends. But that's a separate conversation. One thing I find really interesting is how this has brought into sharp relief different ideas of work in our society, particularly the kind of work that is valued and valuable, and the differences between the two in different circumstances. Because the same kinds of people who are regarded under Priti Patel's immigration policies as low-skilled, people who earn less than £35,000 or £25,000, like nurses, care workers, people who provide to au pairs and anyone else who provides childcare. These are the kinds of people whose work have been vital and instrumental in a time like this. People who work in supermarkets, the list is endless. And these are the people who provide all the vital services that our society actually depends on. And these are the people who are being discriminated against in the Home Office's own immigration policies. This has really exposed the way in which we value certain kinds of work, and how the things that people have previously regarded as low-skilled or less valuable are vital. And the grassroots work that we've been doing has also shifted conversations around what it means to be contributing to a society, to look beyond just, financial contribution or the provision of goods and services for this country's GDP, to think about things around care and creating a better society by supporting those who are vulnerable. And I have a lot of interest in the ethics of care, and this is something that is currently a theme that is quite central in my PhD research. So from a philosophical point of view, the emphasis on the ethics of care and the reimagining of relationships between people, where we're no longer just atomized, but we're actively trying to support each other in a time when we need to be physically isolating, I find has thrown into sharp relief the value of a society that truly is mutualistic and people look after each other.
And just to link that to a feminist perspective, because that's my research and work area, so violence against women and feminist theory, the approaches of the UK government's response to the pandemic has not only been fundamentally premised on so-called unskilled workers, putting the pieces back together, continuing to work in supermarkets and caring roles in, for example, the NHS, but also it's fundamentally predicated on women picking up the pieces as well. So, just stepping up their unpaid labour at home, their reproductive labour, their caring labour, to keep society going through this pandemic. For women, the home is not a neutral space. It's a workplace, and the idea, that the response for everybody to become isolated and go into their homes is obviously the right one in order to curb the pandemic and fight it. But the response from the government has never discussed what that means in terms of women's workloads being times by an immeasurable amount during this time, often on top of their formal paid work. So I'm really excited and hopeful, just to give my answer to my own question, I'm really excited and hopeful for how the pandemic may highlight the invisible, unpaid labour of women that too often we just rely on and we just expect to be there. I hope that we will begin to take this work seriously. And I'm also excited to see how it will impact gender relations in terms of parenting and couples and the home. So as men leave their offices and go back into the home, and although there are many men who are very active partners in equal partnerships, women do, as you probably know, disproportionately shoulder reproductive and domestic labour. I'm interested to see how it will visibilize that work for men, so that they can see what mothers do and see what their partners do, and see every day whilst they're stuck in this self-isolation period, the double shift that women just do all of the time, because they're now taking part in that double shift.
I wholeheartedly agree with what you said there, yeah.
You're absolutely right, Poppy. Yeah. And this is, you've quoted Hochschild there in terms of the double shift, and likewise, there's a lot of work by Joan Tronto on the ethics of care, and particularly work by Elizabeth Spellman about how domestic spaces are a space of household repair, where the idea of repair is to rebuild and recuperate a society, and that work is done, as you said, it's overwhelmingly by women. And there are loads of people here who've been so vocal about this. Joan Tronto, Margaret Urban Walker, Elizabeth Spellman, and I really want to mention that their work is quite revealing about all of this. Weirdly, all of their work precedes all of this by decades, and it's really revealing how they've been so insightful and prophetic about ethical quandaries that have been thrown into such sharp relief almost 18 to 20 years after they published those books to begin with. And you're absolutely right that, there have been voices advocating for this. And a crisis like this has made very material and very immediate the various social and gender dimensions of the ethical questions that we've been facing. And I think it is quite the shift that I'm most optimistic about is the one that you've mentioned, that this has really this should change our conversation around what kind of work, whether it's reproductive labor or caring labor, we value as a society, and how disproportionately it falls on women or people with people from more vulnerable backgrounds. Another aspect of this I find particularly interesting is discourses around disability. And the government's response to this whole crisis has been one that has not fully appreciated how the base standard of being able to live through this crisis requires a certain level of facility, whether it's being physically able or mentally well adjusted to these circumstances to be able to carry out living and weathering this kind of crisis. I have a friend who is above the age of 55 who has recently undergone chemo, and they also have existing respiratory problems. As far as the demographics go for people who are very vulnerable to this disease, they are ticking many boxes. And the issue here is for them to be able to get by is a lot harder for the rest of us in society to get by who might be able-bodied or younger or not have the same kinds of disabilities. And in order for them to get the kind of support they need, they will rely on other people to do that kind of supporting work for them. And this is a problem they face, not because of who they are, but because of the way society is inadequately adjusted to their needs. Stacey Simplican has written about how certain assumptions in our society are fundamentally discriminatory towards people with complex disabilities or needs. And I'm always mindful of how certain people might struggle with this kind of isolation or the aftermath because of their existing physical or mental health conditions. We might all be in this together, but the impact of this is more urgent and more pressing on some people than others. And it's important for us to emphasize those in these conversations as well. And again, there is a gendered dimension to the kinds of people who put in the work of supporting and mainstreaming these needs. There was a statistic that Grant had shared on social media about how upwards of 8 to 9 out of 10 of people working in caring professions or nurses responding to this crisis are women. So it is very much a gendered problem, in as much as the people who are doing the emotional or physical or medical work to respond to this crisis are women. So these are definitely questions that are very pertinent, and the answers are promising. The answers force us to go beyond very rigid neoliberal heteropatriarchal societies that prioritize profit over care, or certain kinds of hierarchical social relations like authority and centralized government over things like grassroots activism and mutual aid. And it's making us reconsider these assumptions and think about how we as individuals can make a better society if everyone works together in solidarity and community rather than atomized, individualized people. So, yeah, that's what I'm most hopeful for. And whether or not this persists is something that is a matter for us to keep fighting for, as Grant said.
Absolutely. What I find scary, though, is that it takes able-bodied people and rich people to get sick and men to practically return to the home and in real terms experience the double shift for us to see these conversations take place in a mainstream sense. And, you know, there's no way that the government would have rolled out what I would say is quite a radical economic program for the Conservatives. That wouldn't have taken place if rich people weren't getting sick and able-bodied people weren't getting sick and men weren't having to return to the home.
And white people not getting sick, because we cannot ignore the racial dimension of this and the fact that this was a disease that started spreading from China, where it was the epicenter, and there are political issues to the way the Chinese government handled this. But it wasn't until Italy became an epicenter of the disease that the Western world took this seriously with emergency and drastic measures. So, you know, there's that dimension to this as well.
Yes, absolutely. If you look at the, mainstream journalistic responses to the Ebola crisis versus the coronavirus, I think that encapsulates what you've just said, Vivek. Absolutely. Sorry, Grant, were you going to jump in there?
I was just to agree with everything that's been said, but just wanted to sort of say that the thing is, what we do have now is there are cracks now in the illusion, and light is getting in. So it's up to every one of us to make sure that these issues of inequality and oppression, that they are more visible, do not become invisible again.
Yes, and another thing about Grant that I just realized is Grant also likes quoting Leonard Cohen.
I was going to actually do that verbatim, and I thought, no, I'll refrain. But you've made the connection. Thanks.
So I think we'll have to end there. Thank you so much to our special guests. So listeners, you've been tuning into my podcast series, Difficult Conversations, and today we've been very lucky to be graced by the presence of Grant Buttars, President of UCU Edinburgh, and Vivek Santayana, PhD researcher and tutor at the University of Edinburgh. So thank you so much to both of you for giving up your time to talk about COVID-19 and how we can link that to these strike issues. Thank you so much.
And thank you.
No worries. Thanks for having us, Poppy.